Here we are at lecture 1.2. The purpose of this lecture is to begin to understand that different texts call for different reading processes. And also we're going to introduce some strategies for reading complex academic articles or just complex texts in general. So let's start with a seemingly stupid question. What is reading? So let's take a look at what we think of a lot when we think of learning to read. So definitely for sure, reading is decoding phonics in order to be able to speak words or hear them in your head, and then to understand the meaning of those words. Also, one thing that these kids are doing is they are using the pictures and the colors and many different cues and clues on the page to understand the meaning, to kind of help them make sense of it. So I do think that this is what we think of when we think of what is reading. Getting words, translating them to meaning, and then making sense of the text. But what does it mean to read the room, for example? Have you ever heard that? Someone says, "Ugh, come on, read the room," after you make a weird or awkward comment. Well, reading the room, for example, is kind of like doing a vibe check. You're looking for clues to make sense of what the people in that space are up to. What are their interests? What's their mood? How can you contribute to it and make sense of what it is? Have you ever thought about reading a movie? So I think when we get into these kinds of definitions of read, we're thinking more of a more complex definition of reading. So for the purposes of this class, reading is using all the clues available to you to interpret some text or composition. And for this course, I want us to think of a text as something that someone created. So that could be written words, that could be visuals, that could be a piece of art like a painting, it could be a movie, it could be lots of things. So you can read books for fun. You can read comics or graphic novels. Those are texts. You can even read video games. While you're actively participating in it as well, it's something that someone made that you're also making sense out of and creating meaning from. You can read movies. Those are texts, and they have more than just words. They also have sounds and images, and it's moving constantly. You can read instruction manuals. You can read poems. You can even read an outfit. What is the meaning of putting all those things together? So reading is a more complex process. Our class will focus, unfortunately, it would be really fun to do a reading fashion class. Maybe that's my next summer's class. But this class is going to be reading academic texts, and it's going to focus on how to do that and how to make sense of it better than we often do, because sometimes these are really confusing and we look at it and we try and we say can't do it and we move on. But let's find a way to really make sense and read these academic articles. So first off, there's a difference between reading actively and passively. Why is it harder to read for school? Why? Well, easy. One, we want to read what we want to read. And when someone tells us what to read, it's kind of a drag and it takes all the fun out of it. However, there's another reason that it's hard to read for school. It's because these are complex texts. They require you to be active, totally engaged. So when you're reading online articles or social media posts, sometimes it's just easier. It's more passive. You're not as active in your mind. But when it gets more complicated, you have to be active. Passive means you're just not thinking that much. You're letting the text wash over you, and if you get something, you get something. But when you're actively reading, you are constantly thinking as you read, and you're trying to understand and make those connections, not just letting it pass you by. So one way to read actively is to participate in what the author Ellen Carrillo calls mindful reading. So we've heard this idea of mindfulness a lot, and whether or not you think it's good for your mental health or kind of a scam, what it means is to be in the moment. That means that you're not distracted or focused on anything else. So when you try to read mindfully, you have to carve out a little space for yourself. You can't just be like, I'm going to read this, in the middle of a loud place where I can't really concentrate. You want to find a time, if you're reading a difficult text, to pay attention, not just to what the words say, but to how you're understanding it and interpreting it. And you want to say, Different types of reading ask me to do different kinds of active processing. So here are some strategies to help you get ready to read these academic articles. The first two are really intuitive, but what we want to do is we want to make it conscious in our minds so that we can be really intentional and get as much good stuff out of it as possible. So the first strategy is to preview. And basically all this means is literally to quickly look over the whole piece. You're looking to determine the genre. What is this about? What is this about? Is this about literature? Is this about science? What kind of article is this going to present to me? Also, you're determining the kind of schema or the elements or frameworks that structure or impact how you read. So what are the different parts that are involved? That might mean looking at the headers and seeing the different sections, maybe looking at the images to make sense of what you can expect to read when you finally get down to it. So you're getting used to what you're reading. You are preparing to take in as much information as possible. We do this all the time with other things. If you're gonna take a trip, for example, if you're gonna go on a run, even sometimes if you're gonna go to a movie, you do a little bit of a preview to get yourself prepared for it. So if you're going on a trip, you wanna say, well, what's the weather so I know what to pack? What are all the things that are there so I can know how much energy to have or what to bring? If you're gonna go on a run, maybe you're gonna preview the place so you'll know, okay, do I need to be prepared for a big hill? What's gonna happen? Or maybe you literally look at a preview of a movie to understand the genre, to see if you wanna watch it, but also to make sense of if you need to bring somebody to cling on to if it's a horror movie so you won't be too freaked out. So previewing basically allows us to activate our prior knowledge and prepare us to do that reading. It's usually an unconscious thing that we do. We usually already preview it. But what I want you to do in this class and in your other classes is to make this a conscious activity so that you can get as much information out of it as possible and prepare you to read in the best possible way. So the point, according to Carrillo, is to become more aware of how reading works so you can use this information to make your reading more productive. So let's go to see what I mean by previewing. We're going to not do that. Let's just move on and I'll see if I can do it at the end. So what is the purpose of skimming? That's the second strategy. To skim is to read the entire thing quickly. And you're not really focusing on actually reading every word in skimming. You're reading quickly in order to see, okay, is this a useful text? Now, for homework 1, you don't have a choice. You do have to read the whole thing. Oops, sorry, or am I? I don't know. I'm the one that made this up. So you have to read the whole thing. But if you are reading academic texts to see if they're going to be good sources for you to use in your research for a paper, you want to be able to skim in order to make that determination. Do you even want to take the time to dig into this text? So skimming allows you to do that. But it also is just a more advanced version of previewing. It gives you a sense of what's coming up. You can prepare for it. You can understand how it's organized and the major points. So when you skim, I want you to look for the title of the piece, the introduction. So often there's an abstract. You want to read most of that. You want to read the title, read most of the abstract. You definitely want to read the first sentence of each paragraph. That is what we call the topic sentence. And that is going to be a very productive step for you because it's going to give you a general sense, like the headline of each of the paragraphs. So you get a good idea of what's happening throughout the entire thing. And then it's also a good idea to read as much of the conclusion as possible. Because then you say, well, what's the main idea here? How do each of the pieces fit together? If I know what the conclusion is, when I go back and read the whole thing from start to finish, I have a better idea of how it all fits together. So you're also going to be noticing what the graphics are trying to say and represent. Then the final strategy that you may not be aware of is what I call mapping. And you are going to have to do mapping for your homework soon. So pay attention here. When you do the mapping strategy, it's something that you do as you read the text carefully. So as you are reading it, you are using a tablet or some kind of an app, or pen and paper. Ever heard of it? And you are creating some kind of visual representation of what you're reading. Now, you don't have to represent the whole text. You might find some important parts that you think, oh, I need to make this into a kind of a chart, or I need to keep track of this information in some visual way. So you can choose how you want to organize the information visually. You might make a bubble map where the center bubble is a main idea and the radiating bubbles are the finer points. Your map might be a chart that takes, say the text is talking about a process and you want to create a kind of chart that shows that process more visually. I've provided a link to a ton of free graphic organizers if you need help getting started. Often students like to read and create whatever comes to mind as they are reading. That's their map. But if you need help getting started, that link is in the course slides and you'll find the link there. So here's some examples of what my students have created in the past. So some of them look really, really messy, but it makes sense for them. Some of them are a lot more structured. They spend a lot of time creating these. This is, again, you can do pencil and paper. This is something more formal. So in this case, all of these strategies should help continue to give you a better sense of how to read and make better sense of academic texts.